Made it all possible for us to live a lifestyle we live. Thank you from the bottom of our heart. I love you, we love you.
It all began under the glow of stadium lights. July 5th, 2025. A night that felt more like a victory lap than a goodbye. The crowd roared, thousands of voices crashing together in the open air of Birmingham's Villa Park. At the center of it all sat Ozzy Osbourne, the man who'd survived more than anyone thought possible, the voice that defined a generation. No one in that sea of fans could have guessed they were witnessing history. Just 72 hours before the end, he was still giving them his all, still wearing that mischievous grin, as if nothing could touch him. But behind the curtain, away from the spotlights, a very different story was unfolding. One that Kelly Osbourne would later reveal in heartbreaking detail. A story of rapid decline, desperate hope, and the confirmed truth about what really took him from the world. And it all happened faster than anyone could have imagined. But the first sign came on that final night in Birmingham. July 5th, 2025 was supposed to be a celebration. The Back to the Beginning concert in Birmingham wasn't just another show on the calendar. It was a homecoming, the city where it all began for Black Sabbath, the place where a young John Michael Osbourne had once dreamed of escaping the factory floor and chasing something bigger. That night, the stage was set for history. The lights dimmed, and the first chords tore through the summer air. The crowd erupted, not the polite applause of casual listeners, but the deafening roar of lifelong devotees who had followed every twist and turn of Ozzy's chaotic, brilliant career. When Ozzy appeared, there was a hush for just a split second. Fans saw him move carefully, almost gingerly, before lowering himself into a chair at the center of the stage. It wasn't the image they were used to. Gone was the leaping, wild figure from the early years, but it didn't matter. The voice was still there. That gravelly, unmistakable sound that carried decades of history in every note. He performed with a rawness that felt almost like confession. Between songs, he smiled at the crowd, blew kisses, and mouthed, "I love you," to the sea of faces in front of him. Sharon stood at the side of the stage, hands clasped tightly, as if holding on to the moment. Kelly was somewhere in the audience, phone in hand, recording her father's final bow without knowing it would become one of the most treasured videos of her life. It was more than music that night. It was connection, a bond between a man and the people who had walked with him through decades of triumphs, scandals, recoveries, and comebacks. When the show ended, Ozzy lingered on stage longer than usual, waving again and again, as if he didn't want to leave. Some would later say it felt like he knew. Maybe he did. Maybe the weight of the years, the battles with his health, had been whispering to him louder than anyone realized. As the stadium emptied, no one could have guessed that this was the last time Ozzy Osbourne would ever sing for an audience. And yet, just behind the scenes, the first cracks had already begun to show. In the days following that powerful night in Birmingham, the world saw the same Ozzy Osbourne they'd always known, smiling in photographs, cracking the occasional joke in short interviews, and maintaining the image of a man still pushing forward. But behind closed doors, the picture was far less reassuring. Ozzy had been battling Parkinson's disease for years, a diagnosis he made public back in 2020. The disease had slowly chipped away at his mobility, his speech, and even his ability to perform the simplest tasks without assistance. Add to that the lingering effects of multiple spinal surgeries, each one carrying its own complications, and you had a body that had taken as much punishment as a lifetime in rock could deliver. Yet, he kept moving. That was Ozzy's way. He refused to let the public see him as fragile. When he was in pain, he'd mask it with humor. When he felt weak, he'd push through a rehearsal or a recording session just to prove to himself he still could. Sharon would later admit that she sometimes wished he'd slow down, but stopping wasn't in his nature. In the week after the concert, subtle changes began to appear. Ozzy seemed quieter. He was sleeping more, talking less, and occasionally losing his balance even when seated. Those closest to him, Sharon, Kelly, and Jack, noticed, but no one wanted to say the words out loud. There's a strange kind of hope in denial. It makes you believe that maybe, if you don't acknowledge the decline, it will go away. Friends who visited described a man who was still mentally sharp, still full of wit, but whose body simply couldn't keep up anymore. The strain of the performance in Birmingham had been worth it, but it had also taken something out of him that he would never get back. By the second week of July, the family quietly adjusted their schedules to be home more. They didn't call it waiting, they called it being there. And although no one said it out loud, there was a growing sense that time might be shorter than they wanted to believe. Then came the morning when that unspoken fear became reality. It was still early, the kind of quiet morning when the world hasn't quite woken up yet. Inside the Osbourne estate, the air was heavy. the house unusually still. At some point in those first hours of daylight, something changed. Whether it was a sudden collapse or a silent warning sign only Ozzy felt, we may never know. What we do know is that someone made the call. Within minutes, sirens were on their way, and a helicopter was being dispatched directly to the property. Neighbors would later say they heard the low, pulsing thrum of rotor blades cutting through the calm sky. The aircraft landed in a clearing just beyond the main house, its crew moving quickly, urgently, toward the front door. Inside, Sharon stayed by his side, holding his hand. Kelly was close too, visibly shaken, but determined to stay in the room. Paramedics worked with practiced precision, voices calm but firm as they coordinated every move. They tried everything: oxygen, advanced cardiac support, the full scope of emergency medicine. Time in moments like these feels distorted. Minutes stretch into hours, and yet it's over in what feels like a breath. After what witnesses describe as hours of continuous effort, the decision was made. Ozzy Osbourne, the man who had cheated death so many times before, was gone. The final moments weren't loud or dramatic. They were heartbreakingly quiet. The beeping of medical monitors faded, replaced by the hushed sounds of family and friends trying to process the reality. Outside, the helicopter blades slowed to a stop, the sudden silence making the loss feel even more real. For decades, Ozzy had been larger than life, a force of nature who seemed immune to the rules of mortality. But in that moment, he was simply a husband, a father, and a man whose story had reached its final chapter at home, surrounded by those who loved him most. And as the news began to spread, the world wanted to know why. The answer came days later, in the form of a single, sobering document. In the hours after Ozzy's passing, the Osbourne home became a fortress of quiet grief. The phones didn't stop ringing. Friends, fellow musicians, media outlets, all desperate for confirmation. But the family said nothing, not yet. Speculation filled the silence. Some claimed it was a sudden, unexpected event. Others whispered about his long-term illnesses finally catching up with him. Social media became a whirlwind of half-truths and outright guesses, each post drawing more attention than the last. It wasn't until several days later that the truth was made official. The death certificate, released through proper channels, told the real story. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. Underlying conditions: acute myocardial infarction, a massive heart attack, compounded by coronary artery disease. On top of that, Parkinson's disease with autonomic dysfunction had weakened his body's ability to regulate its own heartbeat and blood pressure. For years, Ozzy had carried all of this like a hidden weight. Fans knew about the Parkinson's diagnosis, but few understood just how much strain it placed on the rest of his body. His heart had been working against the odds for a long time, each year adding a little more pressure to an already fragile system. The reality was harsh, but it was also strangely fitting. The man who had spent decades defying the odds, surviving substance abuse, accidents, and health crises, had finally been brought down by the same human fragility we all face. It was a reminder that even legends are not indestructible. Sharon and Kelly later agreed that releasing the cause of death wasn't just about satisfying public curiosity, it was about telling the truth on their own terms. Rumors had no place in his legacy, and if the world was going to talk about Ozzy's final hours, they would do it armed with facts, not fabrications. But as the truth came out, another storm was already brewing, one that Kelly herself would step into, determined to defend her father's name. Even before her father's passing, Kelly Osbourne had learned to live with the weight of public scrutiny. Being Ozzy's daughter meant growing up in a world where every family moment, good or bad, could become a headline. But in the final weeks of her father's life, that scrutiny crossed a line she could no longer ignore. A video began circulating online, allegedly featuring Ozzy's voice. In it, he spoke as though his death was imminent, almost as if reading his own eulogy. The tone was eerie, the timing suspicious, and it didn't take long for Kelly to realize what she was hearing wasn't her father at all. It was an AI-generated fake. Her anger was immediate. She took to social media, calling the video disgusting and heartless, condemning those who had made it and those who spread it. But this wasn't just about debunking a single clip. It was about something far bigger. Kelly understood how misinformation could spread like wildfire, especially in the days when a family is most vulnerable. She knew that every false rumor had the potential to distort her father's final chapter, turning a dignified goodbye into a circus of conspiracy theories and clickbait. In interviews, she was clear. My dad wasn't lying in some bed, counting his last breaths. He was still living, still laughing, still being Ozzy. Her statement did two things. It put the world on notice that the Osbourne family would not tolerate the rewriting of their truth, and it reinforced an image of Ozzy that fans cherished. A man who, even in his final weeks, refused to be defined by weakness. But even with the rumors shut down, one final public moment was still to come, a farewell unlike any other. When it came time to lay Ozzy to rest, the Osbournes made a decision that surprised some and comforted others. There would be no grand, star-studded memorial service broadcast on television, no endless line of celebrity speeches. Instead, there would be a small, private funeral attended only by family and the closest of friends. Sharon explained it simply. He would never want a mope fest. Yet outside those private walls, the world's grief couldn't be contained. In Birmingham, the city where his story began, thousands gathered for a public tribute. Streets were lined with fans holding flowers, candles, and hand-painted signs bearing messages like, "Thank you, Ozzy, and forever our Prince of Darkness." It wasn't an organized event. It didn't have to be. Word spread, and people just came. From every corner of the UK, and even from abroad, they gathered outside landmarks tied to his life, from the humble neighborhood where he grew up to the venues where he first played. The most striking moment came when the crowd fell into silence, holding candles high while Paranoid played softly over portable speakers. For a man whose career had been defined by chaos and noise, this moment of stillness felt like the perfect counterpoint, a reminder that even the loudest lives deserve a quiet goodbye. News footage from that night captured strangers embracing, tears in their eyes, united not by personal acquaintance, but by the shared knowledge that they had lived in the same era as Ozzy Osbourne. And yet, beyond the tributes and the tears, there was something even more enduring, the legacy of a man who refused to fade quietly. Ozzy Osbourne's life was the kind of story that couldn't have been scripted. From a working-class childhood in Birmingham to fronting one of the most influential bands in rock history, to solo success, reality TV fame, and cultural immortality, his journey was anything but ordinary. He was outrageous, unpredictable, and often self-destructive, but beneath it all, there was an unshakable resilience. Time and again, he came back from the brink, surviving injuries, addictions, and illnesses that would have ended most careers. The final 72 hours of his life were not the culmination of a slow fade. They were the closing notes of a man who had lived at full volume right up until the end. His last public act was to share music with the city that made him. His last private act was to be surrounded by those who mattered most. Kelly's decision to speak out, to clarify the truth, ensured that his goodbye would not be tainted by lies or sensationalism. It was a daughter's gift to her father, and to the fans who deserved to know the real story. For the millions who grew up with his music, Ozzy's death marked the end of an era. But legends don't really die. They echo, in the riffs that still blast through speakers, in the stories told to new generations, in the way a single lyric can transport someone back to their own youth. And somewhere, in the memories of those last moments, the image remains. Ozzy Osbourne, smiling at his fans one last time, the sound of their cheers still ringing in his ears. Ozzy Osbourne's voice may have gone quiet, but his story is far from over. The music, the memories, the moments we've shared with him, they're still here, waiting to be replayed. And now that you know the truth about his final days, maybe his songs will sound just a little different, a little closer to the heart. If you've been moved by Ozzy's journey, there's so much more to discover. The untold stories, the rare moments, and the surprising truths that even the biggest fans might have missed. So, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. And if you're ready to keep going, click on the next video on your screen right now, because the next story might just change the way you remember another legend.